On a winter night in Denver, when snow falls soft over the Golden Triangle and the streetlights cast long shadows across plum-colored brick, the house at 1310 Bannock Street looks like any other Victorian mansion preserved for tourists. 9 fireplaces, a cast-iron widow's walk, 3,500 square feet of Italianate elegance, later expanded to 10,000. But the foundation rests on something the preservation plaques don't mention. The man who built it in 1883, William Byers, used his newspaper to call for the extermination of Native Americans and celebrated a massacre that killed over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho women, children, and elders. The man who bought it in 1889, William Gray Evans, ran a streetcar monopoly that in 1920 would rather pay for armed strikebreakers and 7 deaths than give workers a raise that would have cost less than the violence. The house became a women's history center in 2018. The ghosts, museum staff say, never left. When you walk those restored hallways tonight, admiring the period furniture and Art Nouveau wallpaper, whose footsteps echo behind you? The celebrated pioneers, or the hundreds who paid for their grandeur in blood? If you're fascinated by the dark foundations behind America's grand historic mansions and the industries that funded them, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which controversial property or estate I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Let's dive in. April 23rd, 1859. 28 years old. 1,000 pounds of printing equipment hauled by ox cart across 700 miles of prairie. William Newton Byers arrived in Denver when the settlement barely qualified as a town. Just tents and rough men along Cherry Creek, where gold fever had drawn maybe 4,000 souls, willing to bet everything on a strike. The place had no government, no law, no future anyone could see clearly. But Byers saw something. He saw a city that didn't exist yet. And he had the one tool that could make people believe in things that weren't there. A printing press. He published the first edition of the Rocky Mountain News the same day he arrived. 20 minutes before a competitor could get their own paper out. That's what mattered in the West. Who told the story first? Who shaped what people believed about a place before they ever saw it themselves? Most of the stories in that first edition, Byers had written while still in Nebraska. He'd never seen the gold fields he described. Never walked the streets he claimed were thriving with opportunity. He wrote it anyway. Boosterism, they called it. Lying, others called it. But the distinction didn't matter much when people were deciding whether to pack their wagons and head west. Byers convinced them to come, thousands of them. And when they arrived, disappointed by what they found, Byers was already too established to fail. The newspaper had become essential. The only source of information in a place where information moved at the speed of a horse. The Rocky Mountain News wasn't just a newspaper. It was political power in printed form. In a territory without statehood, without representation, the person who controlled the press controlled the narrative. Byers knew it, used it. He promoted his friends, destroyed his enemies, and shaped public opinion on every issue that mattered. He worked with Territorial Governor John Evans, a physician and Methodist minister who'd come to Colorado in 1862 with his own ambitions. Evans wanted Colorado to become a state, wanted to be its first senator. But there was a problem that a lot of powerful white men in Colorado Territory in the 1860s decided needed solving. Native Americans lived here. Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples had been here for generations. They had treaties. They had rights, at least on paper. But treaties didn't mean much when there was money to be made, and a railroad to build and land to sell to settlers who wouldn't come if they thought the place was dangerous. In the summer of 1864, some isolated conflicts broke out. Raids on settlers, attacks on stagecoaches. The actual extent of the violence is disputed by historians. Some of it happened, some of it was exaggerated. Some of it probably never happened at all. But the truth didn't matter as much as what people believed. And Byers made sure people believed they were under siege. The Rocky Mountain News began publishing editorials that today read like calls for genocide. On August 10, 1864, the paper printed an editorial that almost certainly came from Byers himself. A few months of active extermination against the Red Devils will bring quiet, and nothing else will. Governor Evans issued a proclamation. He authorized citizens to organize militias, to hunt down hostile Indians, to kill and destroy them as enemies of the country. The Rocky Mountain News printed the governor's call, added its own encouragement, told readers that the boys of the 3rd Regiment would soon be on the warpath. Let the Redskins look out now. This wasn't journalism. This was propaganda. 14 men from the Rocky Mountain News Office enlisted in the regiment that was being formed. Colonel John Chivington, a former Methodist minister who'd become a military officer, took command. He needed a victory. His term was ending. His political ambitions required something he could point to as proof of his effectiveness. So did Evans' ambitions. They both needed an enemy to defeat, and they needed it to look legitimate, documented, celebrated. On November 29, 1864, 700 soldiers under Chivington's command attacked a peaceful encampment at Sand Creek. The Cheyenne and Arapaho there had been told they would be safe. They'd been instructed to camp there by federal officers. They flew an American flag over the camp, a white flag of surrender beside it. Black Kettle, the Cheyenne chief, stood beneath both flags, telling his people not to be afraid, that the soldiers wouldn't hurt them. He was wrong. The attack lasted 8 hours. Soldiers killed approximately 230 people, mostly women, children, the elderly. The men were away hunting. That's why Chivington chose that day. The soldiers scalped the dead, took body parts as trophies, cut fetuses from pregnant women, smashed the heads of children. When they returned to Denver, they paraded through the streets displaying scalps and severed genitalia. The crowd cheered. The Rocky Mountain News called it a great battle, celebrated the deaths, praised Chivington and his men for their valor in subduing the savages. Within weeks, stories started emerging that contradicted the official account. Officers who'd been there testified that it was a massacre, not a battle, that people had been killed while surrendering, that children had been shot at point-blank range. 3 separate federal investigations eventually confirmed what happened. Congressional committees condemned Chivington and called for his court-martial. They rebuked Evans for his testimony, called him out for prevarication and shuffling, expressed disappointment that he refused to acknowledge the horror of what happened. They recommended his removal from office. President Andrew Johnson agreed. Evans was forced to resign on August 1, 1865. His dreams of a Senate seat died with his governorship, but Byers never apologized, never retracted. In 1870, 6 years after the massacre, he was still defending it in print, still arguing that soldiers shouldn't be blamed for killing women and children, still insisting that at Sand Creek, soldiers had been wounded by arrows shot by boys and women, still calling it justified. In 1884, 20 years later, Evans gave an interview where he said the benefit to Colorado of that massacre was very great, that it rid the plains of the Indians. That's what they believed, or what they told themselves they believed. That progress required violence, that civilization required extermination, that the territory's future depended on erasing the people who were already there. By 1878, Byers had sold the Rocky Mountain News. He'd made his money, built his reputation, helped shape a territory into something that could become a state. He was 57 years old, wealthy enough to retire, connected enough to run for office, and he had plans. He wanted to be Colorado's first governor when statehood finally came. The timing seemed right. He'd supported Evans, supported the military, supported every decision that the powerful men of Denver had made, even the ones that congressional investigations had condemned. But there was a problem Byers hadn't accounted for, something personal, something that would destroy his political future in a way no investigation ever could. Her name was Hattie Sancombe, a divorcee from Lawrence, Kansas. Coal gray eyes, auburn hair, a voice that people remembered as soft, a manner described as caressing. She'd written to Byers in 1870 asking if she should move to Denver. Byers, as head of the Board of Immigration, encouraged her. That was his job. Tell people Denver was wonderful. Tell them to come. She came, set up a millinery business in Golden, and at some point the business correspondence became something else, became a relationship, became an affair that lasted several years. Byers was married, had been married to Elizabeth Sumner Byers since 1854. They'd lost 2 children together, survived fires and floods, built a life in Denver when Denver was barely a name on a map. But Byers had a mistress. And in 1875, when his political ambitions required respectability, he tried to end it. Hattie didn't take it well. She wrote letters, dozens of them, maybe 100. Letters that promised revenge, promised suffering. "You've made me hate you again with all the deadly hatred a woman can have for a man," one letter said. "I will kill you," said another. She meant it. On April 12, 1876, she waited for him outside his office. Followed him when he left. Chased him onto a streetcar. When Byers got off and started walking home, she took a pearl-handled pistol from her purse. They struggled in the street. Elizabeth Byers, watching from an upstairs window, saw what was happening. She jumped into a carriage and raced to rescue her husband. Byers let go of Hattie's arms and jumped into his wife's carriage. Hattie raised the pistol, fired. The bullet missed. Elizabeth panicked, dropped the reins. The horse turned sharply. Hattie had another chance. She fired again, missed again. Elizabeth and William escaped home. Their son Frank met Hattie at the gate with a loaded shotgun. She left. Police arrested her 3 blocks away. The Rocky Mountain News, at Byers's orders, printed nothing about the incident. The other Denver papers stayed quiet, too. They had to. Byers could make or break anyone in Denver depending on what he published. But Hattie had other admirers. Other men she'd been involved with after Byers ended things. One of them was George West, publisher of the Golden Transcript. When Byers refused to pay $500 in hush money, West published the story, published Hattie's letters, published Byers's responses. The scandal destroyed him. Not immediately. He tried to push through it. Tried to blame Hattie, calling her a divorced adulteress who'd been persecuting him for a year. But the damage was done. Colorado achieved statehood in August 1876. Byers didn't run for governor. His political career was over before it started. His name was now associated not with Denver's founding, but with a tawdry scandal involving a mistress who tried to kill him in the street. Elizabeth stayed with him. For reasons that aren't recorded, aren't explained in any letters that survive, she chose to remain married to a man who'd betrayed her and then made their private shame public. They stayed together until his death in 1903. In 1883, Byers built a house. Elizabeth had purchased 6 lots at the corner of West 13th Avenue and Bannock Street back in 1868, bought from John Evans after Evans platted 81 acres southeast of Broadway and Colfax. The land sat vacant for 15 years, prime real estate sitting empty while Denver grew around it. The neighborhood was developing into one of the city's most desirable areas. Proximity to the Civic Center, tree-lined streets, wide lots. The kind of place where wealthy families built statements in brick and stone. Then the Byers decided to build. They called it Victoria, an Italianate design, 2 stories. Plum-colored brick made from clay dug somewhere near Denver, fired in kilns that servants tended. Wide eaves that cast shadows across the facade. Flat-pitched roof that spoke to Italian villa aesthetics, translated to the American West. A covered front porch with red tile floors imported from somewhere east, laid by workers whose names weren't recorded. Pressed tin ceiling that caught afternoon light. Cast ornamental details that required skilled craftsmen to install. Inside, 3,600 square feet of carefully designed space. The entry hall with its mahogany woodwork. Stairs that curved up to the 2nd floor. Parlors for receiving guests. A dining room where meals were served by staff who lived elsewhere, who came in each day through the back entrance, who cleaned the fireplaces and polished the silver and set the tables and cleared the dishes and went home to neighborhoods the Byers never visited. Water and sewer service, extraordinarily rare at the time. Most Denver homes still used outhouses, still carried water from wells or public pumps. But the Byers house had running water. Indoor plumbing, a 2nd-story bathroom with a copper tub that someone had to fill bucket by bucket from downstairs. Gas lights in every room that someone had to light each evening, extinguish each morning. 9 fireplaces, each requiring wood or coal to be hauled in, ashes to be hauled out. A cast-iron widow's walk on the roof, where you could stand and look across the city, see the mountains to the west, see the plains to the east. See the territory spread out below you like something you owned, a carriage house out back for the horses, and the carriage and the equipment required to maintain both. Tack room, storage, space for hay and feed, a place for a groom to work, though whether they employed someone full-time or used hired help isn't clear from records. The property had grounds, gardens, trees that Elizabeth tended personally according to some accounts, flowers, vegetable plots maybe, paths. The house was designed to impress, to signal arrival, to demonstrate that William Byers had made it, had gone from hauling a printing press across the prairie to owning one of Denver's finest homes, that he was no longer a frontier newspaperman, but a gentleman, a founder, someone whose name would be remembered. The architect's name was lost to history, or maybe never recorded. That happened. Architects weren't always credited, especially in the West, where styles were copied from pattern books and local builders interpreted them as they saw fit. The builder appears to have been Halleck and Howard, based on correspondence where Byers complained about yard grading, wanted the landscaping finished before summer, wanted everything perfect. The house cost them everything they'd saved, $20,000, which in 1883 was extraordinary. Most Denver homes cost a fraction of that. Working-class families lived in houses that cost maybe $500. Middle-class homes ran a few thousand. $20,000 was elite, was statement money, was the kind of expenditure that said you'd arrived and intended to stay, a fortune built on a newspaper that had called for extermination, that had celebrated a massacre, that had defended the indefensible for 2 decades. The bricks were laid by masons who maybe read the Rocky Mountain News, who maybe believed what Byers wrote, who maybe thought the massacre at Sand Creek was justified because the newspaper told them it was. Or maybe they didn't care. Maybe they just needed the work, needed the wages, laid the bricks because that's what you did when someone with money wanted a house built. And maybe that's the point. That's always the point. That violence creates wealth, that wealth builds monuments, that monuments employ workers, that workers need wages, that everyone becomes complicit, that standing outside the system is nearly impossible when the system controls everything. The newspaper shaped opinion. Opinion shaped policy. Policy created violence. Violence cleared land. Cleared land increased value. Value funded houses. Houses employed builders. Builders fed families. Families read newspapers. The circle closed. They moved in on June 3, 1883, lived there for 6 years, but the scandal never quite left them. The whispers never stopped. And when William Gray Evans, son of former Governor John Evans, offered to buy the house in 1889, Byers accepted. $30,000, a profit. A chance to move somewhere quieter, farther from downtown, farther from the gossip. They relocated to South Denver, to the area that would later become Washington Park. Built another house on East Cedar between Washington and Pearl Streets. When that house was eventually demolished in 1921, the land became William N. Byers Junior High School, named after the newspaper founder, the massacre defender, the man whose mistress tried to kill him. In 2023, after years of pressure, the school changed its name to DSST Cedar. Denver's main library branch, named after Byers, was renamed in 2021. His legacy finally was being reconsidered. But in 1889, when William Gray Evans bought the house on Bannock Street, none of that reckoning had happened yet. Byers was still celebrated as a founder, a pioneer, a builder of cities, and William Gray Evans was following in his father's footsteps. Ambitious, connected, determined to shape Denver's future the way Byers and John Evans had shaped its past. Evans was 34 years old when he bought the house. Born in Evanston, Illinois in 1855, the town was named after his father. So was the university his father had founded, Northwestern. The Evans family moved to Denver in 1862 when Abraham Lincoln appointed John Evans as Colorado's territorial governor. William Gray Evans grew up in a house at 14th and Arapahoe Streets, watched his father build a railroad empire, watched him resign in disgrace after Sand Creek, watched him rebuild his reputation anyway, piece by piece, railroad by railroad, refusing to ever admit he'd done anything wrong. In 1883, William Evans married Cornelia Lunt Gray in the Evans Chapel across the street from the Byers house. The chapel had been built in memory of William's sister Josephine, who died in 1868 at age 24. By 1889, William and Cornelia had 2 children, John, age 5, Josephine, age 2. They'd been living with Cornelia's father, but they needed their own place. When Byers decided to sell, Evans jumped at it, paid $30,000, moved his family in, and immediately began expanding. The house wasn't big enough for his ambitions, wasn't grand enough for what he intended to become. In 1900, a two-story addition was built for William's mother, Margaret Gray Evans, and his sister Anne, who moved in after John Evans died in 1897. An elevator was installed, one of the first residential elevators in Denver. More rooms added, more space created. Bedrooms for Margaret and Anne on the new floors, a music room for Anne's piano, sitting rooms, storage. The house grew from 3,600 square feet to over 10,000. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a compound, a statement, a display of wealth and power that couldn't be ignored. You could see it from blocks away, the mansion at Bannock Street, the Evans place, where Denver's elite gathered, where decisions were made over dinner, where power consolidated itself in mahogany-paneled rooms. And that wealth came from a very specific source, the Denver Tramway Company. William Gray Evans was its president, and the company was a monopoly, the only streetcar system in Denver, the only way most people could get around the city without owning a horse or walking miles. By 1900, the company carried more than 35 million passengers. Denver's population that year was around 134,000, which meant every resident made an average of 261 trips on the tramway. Some made more, some made fewer. But the numbers were staggering. The company touched everyone's life, daily, repeatedly. You couldn't avoid it, couldn't choose a competitor. The tramway was it, and it set the prices, set the schedules, set the routes, determined which neighborhoods got service and which didn't, determined how frequently cars ran, determined how crowded they'd be, determined everything about how people moved through their own city. A private company with a monopoly granted by the city council. How did that happen? The standard story is that William Gray Evans and his partners convinced the council that a unified system would be more efficient than competing lines. That standardization served the public interest. That having one operator meant better maintenance, more reliable service, coordinated schedules, all reasonable arguments, all technically true, but efficiency serves whoever controls it, and the tramway company controlled everything. They'd bought out competitors, outlasted rivals, convinced the city that competition was wasteful, that monopoly was progress, and the city agreed, granted them exclusive rights. Made it illegal for anyone else to run streetcars on Denver's streets, which meant Evans and his investors owned the entire system, not owned as in they built every piece of track themselves, but owned as in they controlled who rode, where they rode, how much they paid, how long they waited, owned the movement of an entire city's population. Think about that power. The ability to make neighborhoods valuable or worthless based on where you extend service. The ability to make certain jobs accessible or inaccessible based on whether you run morning cars. The ability to determine who gets to work downtown based on whether you service their neighborhood. The tramway company shaped Denver's growth more than any single developer because they controlled access. Curtis Park developed because the streetcar went there. City Park, Park Hill, Montclair, South Denver, Berkeley. All these neighborhoods existed as functioning residential areas because the tramway provided service. Property developers either convinced the tramway to extend lines to their land, or they bought land where lines already existed or where lines were planned. You wanted your property to be worth something? You needed the streetcar. And the tramway decided where the streetcar went, which meant William Gray Evans and his investors decided which parts of Denver would thrive and which parts would stagnate, which people would have access to jobs downtown and which wouldn't, which neighborhoods would attract investment and which would be ignored. At a nickel a ride, the streetcar was supposedly affordable, universal, democratic even. Anyone could ride for 5 cents. But affordable doesn't mean much when the company can cut service to neighborhoods it decides aren't profitable enough, when they can reduce frequency so you're waiting an hour for a car, when they can end service at 9 p.m. so night workers can't get home. The nickel fare was fixed by the 1906 franchise agreement, but everything else was negotiable, and the company negotiated in its favor every time. Denver's public transportation started in 1871 with horse-drawn carriages. By 1884, the Denver Railway Company ran 45 cars on 16 miles of track. The city's population had surged from fewer than 5,000 in 1870 to over 50,000 by 1885. People needed to move around. Property developers needed transit lines to make their parcels valuable. Everyone saw the money to be made. In 1885, a group of property owners frustrated by the lack of service on 15th Street formed their own company, the Denver Electric and Cable Railway Company. The founders included John Evans, William Gray Evans, William Byers, and developer Henry C. Brown. That first venture failed fast. The electric streetcar technology used a third rail that shocked people and horses when it got wet, unsafe, unreliable, so they switched to cable cars. Reorganized as the Denver Tramway Company in 1886, William Gray Evans served as secretary, then, in 1902, as president. Under his leadership, the tramway company systematically eliminated competition, bought out rivals, outlasted anyone who tried to compete, built a massive powerhouse near the confluence of the South Platte River and Cherry Creek, extended lines across the city. By 1903, they had 155 miles of track. Carried over 35 million passengers that year. Every resident of Denver made an average of 250 trips on the tramway. You couldn't avoid it, couldn't choose a competitor. The tramway was it, a private company with a monopoly granted by the city council, and William Gray Evans was its president. His father had helped establish it. His business partner, William Byers, had used his newspaper to promote it. They'd all made money. A lot of money. The monopoly shaped Denver's growth. Curtis Park, City Park, Park Hill, Montclair, South Denver, Berkeley. All these neighborhoods existed because the streetcar went there. Property developers either convinced the tramway to extend lines to their land, or they built near existing routes. You wanted your property to be worth something? You needed the streetcar. And the tramway decided where the streetcar went. Which meant William Gray Evans and his investors decided which parts of Denver would grow and which parts wouldn't. Which people would have access to transportation and which wouldn't. At a nickel a ride, the streetcar was supposedly affordable. But affordable doesn't mean much when the company can cut service, reduce frequency, leave entire neighborhoods stranded if it's not profitable enough. The company made William Gray Evans wealthy. Wealthy enough to expand the house on Bannock Street, wealthy enough to invest in other ventures. In 1886, he'd helped incorporate the Denver Gas and Electric Light Company. After his father died in 1897, William transferred the deed to the Byers-Evans house to his wife Cornelia to protect the property from creditors. He was investing in railroads, working with David Moffett to finance the Moffett Tunnel, a 6-mile railroad tunnel through the Continental Divide. When Moffett died in 1911, Evans took over as president of the Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific Railway. Took over the Colorado-Utah Construction Company. Spent the last decade of his life working on projects that would outlive him. Grand plans, infrastructure, the kind of legacy his father had built. The kind that makes cities remember your name. But the tramway company was bleeding. Not from lack of riders, not from competition, from changing circumstances and stubborn refusal to adapt. In 1906, the company had negotiated a franchise agreement with the city that set fares at 5 cents, fixed, permanent. That was fine when costs were stable, but then came World War I inflation. In 1914, streetcar workers started at 24 cents an hour. After 5 years, they could make 30 cents an hour. Tolerable when a 4-room apartment cost $10 a month and 22 pounds of sugar cost $1. But prices exploded. Food costs jumped 41%. Rent increased 19%. Clothing costs rose 60%. Workers couldn't survive on the same wages, but the tramway company couldn't raise fares. The 1906 franchise agreement locked them in at a nickel. In 1918, workers formed a union, Local 746 of the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees of America. Within a year, they'd successfully lobbied the War Labor Board for an 8-hour day and a wage increase. The tramway company ignored the order, cut wages anyway. Workers went on strike for 4 days in July 1919. The strike ended with promises. The company would negotiate, would discuss wages, would treat workers fairly, but by 1920, the promises meant nothing. The company wanted to cut wages unless the city allowed fare increases. The public opposed fare increases. The city wouldn't allow it. The company cut wages and laid off hundreds of workers anyway. Service was reduced across the city. People waited longer for streetcars that came less frequently. Workers who kept their jobs were making less money while costs kept rising. In July 1920, the workers delivered an ultimatum. Raise wages to 75 cents an hour, or there would be a strike. The deadline was August 1st, 1920. The company had a different plan. 5 days before the deadline, they contacted John Jerome, a professional strikebreaker from San Francisco, known as Blackjack Jerome. He specialized in breaking unions. He had a crew ready, men he could deploy on short notice, armed men, violent men, men who didn't care about Denver or its workers or what happened to the city after they left. They just needed to keep the streetcars running long enough to break the strike. At 5:30 a.m. on August 1st, 1920, union members voted, 887 in favor of striking, 11 opposed. The strike was on. Within hours, 100,000 people in Denver had no way to get to work. Streetcars sat silent. The city ground to a halt. Jerome's men arrived, armed with revolvers and rifles, not deputized by the county, not sworn in as special police, just private armed men working for a private company. They wore no uniforms, had no legal authority, but they had guns, and the company told them to run the streetcars. On Monday, August 2nd, the first day of the strike, 100,000 people found other ways to get around, walked, rode bicycles, carpooled in the few automobiles that existed. The city adapted. Tuesday was quieter, tense, but no real violence. The strikebreakers operated a few cars. Union members and their supporters watched, shouted, but didn't attack. Then on Wednesday, August 4th, something broke. The details are disputed. The timeline unclear. What's known is that violence erupted. Strikebreakers and union sympathizers clashed at 16th and Lawrence Streets. A streetcar was surrounded, derailed. Strikebreakers sprayed the crowd with fire extinguishers, got the car back on the rails. A bystander named Charles Harris was injured, not seriously, but it was a warning. Things were escalating. Thursday, August 5th. 2,000 labor sympathizers paraded through downtown. Charles Alstrom, president of the Denver Trades and Labor Assembly, met with Mayor Dewey Bailey. Proposed arbitration. Bailey agreed to consider it. Around 5 p.m., Alstrom addressed the crowd outside, warned them not to fall into the trap, told them the tramway company wanted violence, wanted an excuse to crack down, told them to stay calm. His advice came too late. The crowd attacked a group of Jerome's strikebreakers. Bricks, rocks. One man's jaw was broken, another's head was gashed. Almost simultaneously, other protesters converged downtown. Cigar makers, railroad employees, union members from across the city. They marched to the Denver Post building. The newspaper had sided with the tramway company, published editorials blaming the workers, calling them troublemakers. The mob stormed the building, destroyed furniture, smashed printing equipment, wrecked the editorial offices, broke windows, set fires. The police couldn't stop them. There weren't enough officers. The mob was too large, too angry. By evening, the violence had spread to East Denver, near the streetcar barns. A crowd gathered across the street. Men, women, children. Some there to support the strike, some just curious, some looking for trouble. Around 11 p.m. So Jerome's strikebreakers, panicked by the size of the crowd, opened fire. Leonard Temmer, 16 years old, was shot in the knee. His leg was amputated the next day. He died on August 9th without waking from the anesthetic. He'd been entering a tramway restaurant, wasn't part of the crowd, wasn't threatening anyone, just a boy in the wrong place. Frank Miller, 38 years old, was walking home from work. A shot hit him in the back. He died without recognizing his wife when she found him. He wasn't a striker, wasn't a rioter, just a man trying to get home. Charles Hanson, 23 years old, an expressman, was shot near the barns, killed instantly. In total that night, 3 people died. 32 were seriously injured. Friday, August 6th, the National Guard was mobilized. The violence continued. More people were shot, more injured. By the end of Friday night, 2 more were dead. 11 others in the hospital. 7 deaths total over 2 nights. 50 people seriously wounded. Some would carry those injuries for the rest of their lives. On Saturday, August 7th at 1:30 p.m., Mayor Bailey and Colorado Governor Oliver Shoup placed Denver under federal military control. 250 soldiers from Fort Logan occupied downtown. Jerome's strikebreakers were disarmed. The soldiers rode the streetcars instead, protected the cars, protected the scabs who were still operating them, but also prevented more killings. The violence stopped. Not because the strike was resolved, not because anyone had negotiated, but because the federal government imposed order at gunpoint. The strike officially ended with no concessions to the workers, no wage increases, no improved conditions. Instead, the tramway company fired more than two-thirds of the strikers. Hundreds of men lost their jobs, replaced by strikebreakers, replaced by new hires willing to work for whatever the company offered. Organized labor in Denver was crushed. The strike that was supposed to give workers leverage instead destroyed their union, made it harder for workers across the city to organize for decades. The tramway company spent $500,000 breaking the strike, more than enough to have paid for the wage increase the workers wanted. The math was brutal. They'd rather spend money on violence than give workers a raise. They'd rather hire armed men and provoke a riot and watch people die than admit the workers had a point. William Gray Evans wasn't directly involved in the strike. He'd retired from active management of the tramway company in 1913, stepped back to focus on other projects, the Moffat Tunnel, the railroad ventures, but he'd built the monopoly, created the structure that made the company powerful enough to refuse negotiation, established the precedent that the tramway didn't have to care what workers wanted because workers couldn't go anywhere else. There was no competition, no alternative. If you wanted to work on Denver's streetcars, you worked for the tramway, on their terms, for their wages. And if you complained, they'd hire someone else, or hire armed strikebreakers to keep you in line. That was the system Evans had helped build. That was his legacy. 7 deaths, 50 wounded, a strike broken by violence, and a company that went bankrupt anyway. In 1924, William Gray Evans died at the house on Bannock Street. He was 68 years old. His son John said that William and his father had been dreamers and believers in the future. Said William died financially exhausted, but with great faith that his dreams would become reality. Financially exhausted. After a lifetime of building monopolies and extracting wealth from a city that had no choice but to use his services. After spending a fortune on the Moffat Tunnel project that would take years more to complete. After building a 10,000-square-foot mansion. After living in luxury while the workers who made his fortune possible died for wanting a living wage. Financially exhausted, as if that were tragedy, as if that made him sympathetic. Cornelia Evans outlived her husband by 31 years, died in 1955. The house remained in the family. Their daughters lived there. Josephine, Margaret, Catherine, Anne Evans, William's sister, also lived in the house, never married, became a patron of the arts, helped establish the Denver Art Museum, funded cultural institutions across the city, tried to build a legacy that wasn't tainted by blood and exploitation. But she still lived in the house built with money from a newspaper that called for genocide and a streetcar monopoly that provoked a massacre. Good works don't erase origins. Charity doesn't cleanse foundations. The house stood, solid, well-maintained, filled with beautiful things. Original furniture, glassware, china, art, the accumulation of a century of wealth, and the neighborhood around it changed. The Golden Triangle developed. The Denver Art Museum was built next door, massive structures that dwarfed the old Victorian mansion. The Byers-Evans house looked small, fragile, threatened by progress the same way the city it helped build had threatened others. In 1968, the house received a Denver Landmark designation. In 1970, it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. In 1974, it became the only single-family home included in the Civic Center National Historic District. Recognition that it was historically important, worth preserving, but preservation raises questions. What exactly are we preserving? The architecture? The furniture? The legacy of the families who lived there? Or all of it, entangled, inseparable? In 1981, Margaret Evans Davis died, the last resident. The family donated the house and all its contents to the Colorado Historical Society, now called History Colorado. It was restored to its 1912 to 1924 appearance, open to the public as a museum, a place where people could come see how Denver's elite lived in the early 20th century. Tour the rooms, admire the craftsmanship, learn about the families. But something else came with the house, something the preservation efforts didn't account for. The museum staff began reporting strange occurrences. Voices in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own, furniture that was rearranged overnight, footsteps in hallways where no one was walking, shadow figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, full-body apparitions dressed in early 20th century clothing. Some people believed it was the Evans family, spirits attached to their possessions, unable to let go of the house they'd loved. Margaret Evans, who'd lived there her entire life. Anne Evans, the art patron. Josephine and Catherine. Maybe Cornelia and William Gray, too. Still walking the halls they'd walked when alive. Still occupying rooms they'd claimed as their own. But there were other incidents. Darker ones. Encounters that didn't feel benign. Didn't feel like residual energy from deceased owners. New managers reported being overwhelmed by malevolent presences. Spirits that seemed angry, aggressive, unconnected to the Evans family. One psychic who investigated the house claimed there was a portal, a doorway to another realm, that any spirit could pass through, that the house was attracting entities from anywhere, from any time, with no connection to the property at all. Whether that's true or not, whether you believe in such things or dismiss them as nonsense, the stories persisted. The staff learned to accommodate. The current manager, according to reports, speaks to the spirits when she enters the building each morning, tells them she means no harm, asks them to leave her alone, a negotiation with the unseen, an acknowledgement that the house contains more than just history. In 2018, History Colorado made a decision. House museums were declining in popularity. People weren't as interested in touring old homes just to see how wealthy families had lived. The format felt stale, elitist, a celebration of privilege without sufficient examination of where that privilege came from or what it cost. So they transformed the Byers-Evans house into the Center for Colorado Women's History, the first space in the state dedicated specifically to women's history. A way to honor the influential women who'd lived in the house. Elizabeth Byers, who'd founded charities and endured public humiliation. Margaret Gray Evans, who'd supported her husband through scandal and loss. Anne Evans, who'd shaped Denver's cultural landscape. The daughters who'd lived quiet lives of privilege and patronage. It's a reframing, an attempt to tell a different story about the house, to focus on the women rather than the men. On creativity and charity rather than violence and extraction. But the foundation remains the same. The money that built the house came from a newspaper that called for extermination. The money that expanded it came from a streetcar monopoly that killed workers rather than pay them fairly. The house stands as monument and tomb, celebration and indictment. A place where Denver's founding families lived in comfort while the city around them was built on land, taken by force and labor, crushed by violence. That's the contradiction at the heart of so many historic preservation efforts. We want to honor the past, want to save beautiful things, want to remember the people who shaped our cities, but we want to do it without confronting what made those beautiful things possible. Sand Creek. 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho killed, women, children, elders, their bodies mutilated, their scalps paraded through Denver's streets while crowds cheered. The Rocky Mountain News celebrated it, called it a great battle, never retracted, never apologized. William Byers defended the massacre for the rest of his life. In 1870, he was still insisting that soldiers shouldn't be blamed for killing children. In 1884, John Evans was still saying the massacre benefited Colorado, that it rid the plains of Indians. They believed this, or told themselves they believed it, or knew it was monstrous but refused to admit it because admitting it would mean acknowledging that everything they'd built rested on atrocity. The house was built in 1883, 19 years after Sand Creek. The massacre wasn't ancient history when Byers laid the foundation. It was recent. Documented, investigated by Congress, condemned by multiple committees, and Byers didn't care. Built his mansion anyway, lived in it for 6 years before selling it to the son of the man who'd authorized the attack. The Denver tramway strike of 1920. 7 people killed, 50 wounded, federal troops occupying the city, a broken union, hundreds of workers fired, families left without income, men who just wanted a wage that matched inflation. 75 cents an hour, that's what they asked for. The company spent $500,000 to refuse, $500,000 on strikebreakers, weapons, legal fees, repairs, lost revenue. More than enough to pay every worker what they'd requested. But the company chose violence, chose to hire Blackjack Jerome and his armed crew, chose to provoke confrontations, chose to let strikebreakers open fire on crowds that included children. And when it was over, the company went bankrupt anyway, not immediately. It limped along for years, but the monopoly couldn't survive changing technology. Cars replaced streetcars, buses replaced both. By the time the Regional Transportation District took over public transit in Denver, the tramway company was a failed enterprise. All that wealth, all that power, all those deaths, for nothing that lasted. The house, though, the house survived. Outlasted the newspaper, outlasted the tramway company, outlasted the reputations of the men who built it. It stands now as a museum, a center for women's history, a place where tours are offered, where exhibits are mounted, where scholars research the role of women in Colorado's development. All worthy goals, important work, but the foundation hasn't changed. The bricks are still plum-colored, the fireplace is still number 9, the cast-iron widow's walk still rises above the roof, and the money that paid for every inch of it still came from blood, whose blood gets complicated. The Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek, certainly, but also the newspaper readers who believed what buyers told them, the settlers who came west thinking they'd be safe because the military would protect them from savages, the soldiers who followed Chivington's orders, the workers who kept the tramway running for wages that didn't cover costs, the strikebreakers who fired into crowds, the children shot for being in the wrong place. All of them paid, some with their lives, some with their labor, some with their ignorance, some with their complicity. Elizabeth Byers paid too, married to a man who betrayed her, humiliated publicly when his mistress tried to kill him. Forced to choose between divorce, which would have left her destitute, or staying with him, which meant everyone knew she'd stayed with a man who'd strayed. She stayed, founded charities, helped establish the Ladies' Relief Society, supported the Denver Orphans' Home, did good work, but her name is still attached to his. The house is still the Byers-Evans house, not the Byers house or the Evans house. Both families, both legacies. Inseparable now. Margaret Gray Evans lived through her husband's death, watched her son become a powerful man, watched her daughter Anne become a cultural force, watched the house fill with art and music and the kind of refined society that wealthy families cultivate. And she lived in a house bought with money from her father's failed governorship and her husband's streetcar monopoly. Cornelia Evans raised 4 children in that house. Watched one son go into banking, watched her daughters become patrons of the arts, lived there for 66 years, died in 1955, probably in one of the rooms that museum visitors now walk through. Her furniture is still there, her glassware, her china. 90% of the original contents of the house remain, which means 90% of what visitors see belonged to the family, was chosen by them, arranged by them, used by them. Objects that carry memory. That's what some people believe. That objects absorb the energy of the people who own them. That a house filled with original furnishings isn't just a museum. It's a vessel, a container for the past that hasn't quite become past. The ghost stories might be dismissed as superstition, psychological projection, the power of suggestion in an old house where the floorboards creak and the walls settle. But the staff reports are consistent, specific. Multiple people over years describing similar phenomena, voices, footsteps, figures in period clothing, doors that open after being closed, furniture moved overnight, piano music when no one's playing, children's laughter in rooms where no children are present. These could be fabrications, could be marketing, ghost tours bring tourists, haunted houses get attention. There's incentive to promote the stories, but the staff members who report these things don't seem interested in promotion. They seem unsettled, uncertain. They work there. They experience things they can't explain, and they've learned to coexist with whatever's happening. Speak to the spirits, acknowledge them, make peace. It's practical. If you work in a house where doors open on their own, you either quit or you adapt. Most of them adapt. What does it mean if the house is haunted? If the dead really do remain, tethered to the place they loved or the place where they suffered? What does that say about the Byers-Evans house? Are the ghosts the family members, lingering because they can't let go? Or are they the people who died to build the fortune that bought the house? the Cheyenne and Arapaho massacred at Sand Creek, the workers shot during the strike, the children caught in crossfire, the anonymous laborers who built the streetcar lines, the servants who cleaned the fireplaces and polished the mahogany and never got their names recorded in any history. Whose spirits would have more reason to remain? The wealthy who enjoyed the house, or the exploited who paid for it? The portal theory is interesting, the idea that the house contains a doorway that allows any spirit from any time to enter. That would explain encounters with entities that have no connection to the property. That would mean the house has become a gathering place for the restless dead, a crossroads, a threshold. But it would also mean the house itself has some quality that attracts them, some energy or resonance or structural feature that makes it permeable. And maybe that's true. Maybe places where violence was celebrated and suffering was ignored do develop a kind of spiritual weight, a density that draws things to it. The house was built with massacre money, expanded with monopoly money. If that leaves a mark, wouldn't the mark attract more darkness? Wouldn't it compound? Denver's history is full of contradictions, a city that celebrates its pioneers without examining what those pioneers did to become successful. A place that names schools and streets and buildings after men who called for genocide or defended it or profited from it. And then, slowly, decades later, starts removing those names, starts questioning, starts acknowledging that maybe the story we've been telling about our founders isn't complete, that maybe the celebrated version of events left out some inconvenient truths. In 2021, a Denver library branch named after William Byers was renamed for John M. Hula Jr., a descendant of Sand Creek survivors. In 2023, Byers Junior High School became DSST Cedar. The process of reckoning is slow, incomplete, but it's happening. The Byers-Evans house sits in the middle of this tension. It's a beautiful building, architecturally significant, well-preserved, full of art and craftsmanship and objects that tell stories about how a certain kind of family lived in a certain time. That has value, historical value, educational value, but it's also a monument to extraction, to violence justified as progress, to wealth built on suffering. Both things are true. The house is beautiful and the house is built on blood. The families who lived there did good things and they benefited from atrocity. The women who are now celebrated ran charities and they lived in comfort that workers paid for with their lives. All of it is true. None of it cancels out the rest. That's what makes the house so compelling and so uncomfortable. It forces the question we'd rather avoid. How do we remember the past when the past is this messy? Do we celebrate the good and ignore the bad? Do we condemn the bad and erase the good? Or do we hold both at the same time? Acknowledge that history is complicated, that people are complicated, that a newspaper founder can also be a massacre defender, that a streetcar company president can also be complicit in workers' deaths, that women who ran charities can also benefit from systems that crush the poor. They're not contradictions. They're the same story, the same people. The same choices, consequences rippling outward across generations until we're standing in a museum trying to make sense of it. The museum tour, as it exists now, focuses on the women, on Elizabeth Byers' charitable work, on Margaret Evans' support of her family, on Ann Evans' contributions to Denver's art scene, on the daughters who lived refined lives and left behind beautiful objects. That's a choice, a curatorial decision. Center the women. Make their stories the frame. It's not wrong. Women's history has been neglected, deserves attention, deserves a dedicated space, but it's also selective. It asks visitors to admire the charity without asking where the money for charity came from, to appreciate the art without examining the labor that made art patronage possible, to celebrate the women's resilience without acknowledging that they were resilient inside a fortress built by violence. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe we expect too much from a house museum. It's not supposed to be a comprehensive indictment of capitalism and colonialism. It's supposed to preserve a building and tell stories about the people who lived there. But those stories are never neutral. They always leave things out. And what we leave out shapes what people believe about the past. If you tour the Byers-Evans house and come away thinking these were just successful families who lived in a beautiful home, you've been told an incomplete story. If you come away thinking these were monsters whose legacies should be erased, you've been told an incomplete story. The complete story is harder. requires holding tension. Requires accepting that the people we celebrate were also people who caused harm, that the buildings we preserve were paid for by suffering, that history doesn't divide neatly into good guys and bad guys. The ghosts, if they exist, know this. They don't care about curatorial decisions, don't care about how we frame the narrative. They're just there, existing in spaces between what happened and what's remembered. Between the official version and the truth we can't quite acknowledge. The voices in empty rooms, the footsteps in dark hallways, the figures in period clothing who appear and vanish. Maybe they're literal, maybe they're metaphor, maybe they're the past refusing to stay past, insisting on presence, on being heard, on complicating the story we'd prefer to tell. When you walk through the Byers-Evans house today, you walk through rooms that still contain 90% of their original furnishings. The dining room table where the families ate, the chairs where they sat, the beds where they slept, the desks where they wrote letters. All of it still there, still arranged as it was, still carrying the weight of use. And if objects do absorb energy, if they retain something of the people who touch them, then you're surrounded by the past in physical form. The glassware holds traces of hands that lifted it. The piano remembers fingers that played it. The portraits on the walls still watch the rooms they watched a century ago. It's intimate, unsettling. You're in someone's home. A home that's trying to be a museum but can't quite shake off the feeling of being a home. The staff closes up each night, turns off the lights, locks the doors, leaves the house to whatever happens in houses when no one's watching. And in the morning, sometimes things are different. Doors that were closed are open. Chairs that were straight are turned. Objects that were in one room are in another. You can explain that away. Old buildings shift. Temperature changes cause wood to expand. Locks don't always catch properly. There are rational explanations, but the rational explanations pile up, and at some point you're left with either accepting that the house is impossibly accident-prone or accepting that something else is happening, something you can't quite see. The manager speaks to the spirits each morning, a ritual, an acknowledgement. She tells them she means no harm, asks them to coexist peacefully, and apparently it works. The activity doesn't stop, but it doesn't escalate. The house functions as a museum. Tours happen, exhibits open, scholars use the archives. The work continues, and whatever walks those halls after closing does so without disrupting the public-facing mission. It's a kind of détente, the living and the dead occupying the same space, neither quite yielding, neither quite dominant. Just coexisting. That feels appropriate. It mirrors the historical contradiction. The past and the present in the same building, the celebration and the condemnation in the same breath, the beautiful and the terrible inseparable. Sand Creek happened 160 years ago next year. The people who were killed there are gone. Their descendants carry the trauma. The Cheyenne and Arapaho nations still exist, still remember, still mourn. In 2007, a Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site was established, a place to remember what happened, to honor the victims, to acknowledge, finally, officially, that it was a massacre, not a battle, not justified, a massacre. In 2014, Governor John Hickenlooper formally apologized to the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples on behalf of Colorado. Better late than never, but late, very late. In 2021, Governor Jared Polis rescinded the 1864 proclamations that John Evans had issued, the ones that authorized citizens to hunt down and kill Native Americans, the ones that created the conditions for Sand Creek. Better late than never, but late. The Denver tramway strike happened 104 years ago this past August. 7 people died, 50 were wounded. The company went bankrupt. The union was broken. The workers who survived lost their jobs or worked for reduced wages. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Leonard Temer, Frank Miller, Charles Hanson, the others who died that week. Their footnotes in labor history, casualties of a strike that accomplished nothing except proving that companies would kill workers before negotiating. There's no monument, no historic marker, no official apology. The Regional Transportation District, which replaced the tramway company, doesn't acknowledge that history. The building that served as the tramway headquarters is now the Hotel Teatro, a boutique hotel, elegant, expensive. People stay there without knowing what happened in 1920, without knowing that armed strikebreakers once occupied those floors, that 7 people died so a company could maintain control. The Byers-Evans house stands between these histories, not chronologically. Chronologically, it came after Sand Creek and before the strike, but conceptually, it sits between. A physical manifestation of wealth extracted from violence, a monument to the men who justified massacre and crushed labor, and a reminder that those men had families, had wives and children who maybe didn't make the decisions but benefited from them, who lived in comfort purchased by cruelty, who now are celebrated as pioneers and patrons while the victims remain footnotes. What do we do with that? How do we hold that complexity? The current answer is the Center for Colorado Women's History. Focus on the women, tell their stories, make the house about them. It's a partial answer. It acknowledges that women were there, that they had agency, that they contributed to Denver's development. But it doesn't fully resolve the contradiction, because the women's stories are still tangled up with the men's stories. Elizabeth Byers' charity work doesn't exist independently of William Byers' newspaper. Anne Evans's art patronage doesn't exist independently of William Gray Evans's streetcar monopoly. You can't separate them. They lived in the same house, ate at the same table, benefited from the same fortune. To tell one story without the other is incomplete. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the house exists now to make us uncomfortable, to force us to sit with the contradiction, to refuse easy answers. The tour guides tell you about the charitable work, about the art, about the refined society, but they also, if you ask, will tell you about Sand Creek, about the tramway strike, about Hattie Sankum and the scandal. They don't hide it. The information is there, on plaques, in exhibits, in the guided tours. You just have to be willing to hear it, to not tune out when the story gets uncomfortable, to not focus only on the pretty furniture and ignore what paid for it. The ghosts, again, don't offer that luxury. They don't let you forget. They remind you that houses remember, that walls absorb, that history isn't safely in the past. It's here, now. Walking the same hallways you're walking, opening doors you thought you'd closed, moving things you thought you'd left alone. Whether that's literal haunting or metaphorical haunting, whether you believe in spirits or just in psychological weight, the effect is the same. The past isn't past. It's present, active, insistent. Denver wants to be a city that honors its history, that preserves its important buildings, that remembers its founders. But Denver is also, slowly, becoming a city that questions its history, that asks whose version of events we've been telling, that wonders why certain people are celebrated and others forgotten, why certain buildings are preserved and others demolished, why certain stories get told and others erased. The Byers-Evans house is at the center of that questioning. It's one of Denver's oldest surviving homes, architecturally significant, well preserved, historically important, and it's also a building that raises questions we're still learning to ask, about whose history matters, about whose suffering we acknowledge, about what we owe to the past and what we owe to the truth. The house will stand. It's protected, designated, too important to demolish, too entangled in Denver's story to erase. But what the house means will continue to evolve, will continue to be contested. The current interpretation focuses on women's history. That might change. Future curators might make different choices, might foreground different stories, might find new ways to hold the contradiction between beauty and violence, between preservation and condemnation, between honoring the past and confronting it. What won't change is the foundation, the plum-colored brick, the 9 fireplaces, the cast-iron widow's walk, the rooms that still hold the furniture the Evans family used, the walls that still carry whatever memories walls carry, the house as structure, as object, as place where things happened and things continue to happen, where the living walk and maybe where the dead walk too, where history is both preserved and contested, where the story Denver tells about itself gets complicated by the story the house tells about Denver. On quiet nights, when the museum is closed and the neighborhood is sleeping and snow falls soft over the Golden Triangle, the house on Bannock Street sits dark. The lights are off, the doors are locked, the alarm is set, and inside, in rooms that have been carefully restored to reflect a specific period, objects sit exactly where curators place them, exactly where they're supposed to be. Until morning, when the staff arrives and finds that something has moved, that a door they closed is open, that a chair is turned, that footsteps have disturbed the dust in a room no one entered. They document it, record it, adjust what needs adjusting, speak to the spirits, ask for cooperation, and then they open the house to visitors, to people who come to see how Denver's elite lived, to people who come to learn about women's history, to people who come hoping to glimpse a ghost. What those visitors see depends on what they're looking for. If they're looking for elegance, they'll find it. The house is elegant, the furniture is beautiful, the craftsmanship is extraordinary. If they're looking for scandal, they'll find that too. The plaques mention Hattie Sankum, mention Sand Creek, mention the tramway strike. The information is there. If they're looking for ghosts, they might find those, or they might not. Ghosts are selective, unpredictable. They appear when they want, to who they want. And if you don't see one, that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means they chose not to show themselves. But whether you see ghosts or not, whether you believe in them or not, the house asks you to reckon with something, with the idea that places hold memory, that wealth has origins, that the past isn't neutral, that the beautiful and the terrible can occupy the same space, that people are complicated, that history is messy, that preservation requires honesty, that we can honor the architecture without lionizing the architects, that we can study the past without sanctifying it, that we can hold contradiction, that we must hold contradiction, because the alternative is erasure, either erasing the good or erasing the bad. Either telling sanitized stories about pioneers who built a city or refusing to acknowledge anything they accomplished because of what they did to accomplish it. The Byers-Evans house won't let us do either. It insists on both. It's a beautiful building filled with blood money, a women's history center founded on masculine violence, a preserved past that won't stay past, a monument and a warning, a museum and a confession. It stands in the heart of Denver, 1 block from Civic Center Park, surrounded by modern buildings that dwarf it, and it refuses to be ignored, refuses to be simple, refuses to offer easy answers about how we should remember the founders of this city. It just stands there, solid, complicated, haunted by what it knows and what it won't say, haunted by the people who lived there and the people who died to make that living possible. Haunted by questions we're still learning to ask. When the last tour leaves each day and the staff locks up and the lights go dark, the house settles into itself, into whatever it is when no one's watching, whatever happens in rooms that remember, in hallways that echo, in spaces where the past refuses to be past, the voices, the footsteps, the doors that open, the figures that appear in early 20th century clothing and then vanish. Real or imagined, literal or metaphorical, it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. The house won't let you forget, won't let you reduce it to a simple story, won't let you admire the fireplaces without thinking about who paid for them, won't let you celebrate the women without asking about the men, won't let you preserve without also condemning, won't let you look away. That's what haunting is, not ghosts necessarily, but refusal. The past refusing to be buried, refusing to be sanitized, refusing to be comfortable. The Byers-Evans house is haunted. By spirits maybe, by history certainly, by the question that every preserved building eventually asks, what are we preserving and why? What story are we telling and who does it serve? What are we willing to remember and what are we trying to forget? The house doesn't answer those questions, it just asks them over and over. In every room, in every piece of furniture, in every plaque on the wall, in every ghost story the staff tells, in every tour that walks through trying to make sense of beauty and violence existing in the same space. The house asks, and then it waits for us to answer, waits for us to decide what kind of relationship we want with our past, what kind of city Denver wants to be, what kind of history we want to preserve, and how honestly we're willing to tell it. Until then, the house stands, the ghosts walk, the staff speaks to them each morning, the tours continue, the exhibits change, the story evolves, and somewhere, in rooms that used to be bedrooms and parlors and dining rooms, in spaces that once held laughter and conversation and all the daily details of living, something remains, some trace, some memory, some refusal to let the past be only past, some insistence that what happened here matters, that who lived here matters, that how they lived matters, and that maybe, if we're willing to sit with the discomfort, if we're willing to hold the contradiction, If we're willing to acknowledge both the beauty and the cost, we might learn something about ourselves, about what we value, about what we're willing to excuse, about whose stories we tell and whose we ignore, about what haunts us and why, about what we owe to the past and what we owe to the truth. The house waits for that reckoning, has been waiting for 141 years, can wait longer. It's patient, it has time, it's not going anywhere. Neither are the ghosts, neither is the history, neither is the question of what we do with places like this. Places where the beautiful and the terrible meet. Where progress and violence are inseparable. Where preservation and condemnation must somehow coexist. The Byers-Evans house stands at that intersection, asks us to stand there too, asks us to look at it honestly, all of it. The plum-colored brick and the massacre, the cast-iron widow's walk and the strike, the beautiful furniture and the broken union, the charitable women and the violent men, the elegant parties and the 7 deaths, all of it. Together, inseparable, haunted,